It's a real pleasure to be here with you, Mr. Deputy Foreign Minister, and I welcome you to this edition of the Fort Ross Dialogue, a dialogue inspired by the courageous voyaging and exploration of the Russian sailors and other adventurers that came to the Arctic, to Alaska, and then to California. It's a part of our state. It's a beautiful part of our state. And the fact that Russians were here in 1814, while most of our history was going on 3,000 miles away in Washington, it's a striking fact that we in California are particularly aware of. And I find that the past, while past, nevertheless can be an inspiration for the future. And having Russian people inhabiting, living, producing food, working out relationships with the indigenous people way back in 1814 is an important historic fact. And as we look forward now to this very dangerous century, it's an occasion for us to speak and to explore issues that are of a timely nature, that are on the agenda as we speak. So in the spirit of California, the spirit of Fort Ross, we have these meetings. And I think it's extraordinary that you're here speaking in dialogue, and I'll do my best to give my perspective and listen to yours. And in dialogue, we're not trying to push the other person, but rather to listen, to show up and be present, and out of that to learn. And that's certainly what I hope our respective presidents can do, be present to one another, hear the very different perspectives which they have, and then to find common ground. And so I think the Fort Ross Dialogue, very appropriate. I think it's very appropriate, particularly now when we face a world not just of national rivalries, but of common vulnerabilities. Russia and the United States both face the pandemic, both face the danger of nuclear weapons being used by way of miscalculation or mistake or blunder, as former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry calls it, and both face the dangers of artificial intelligence being developed and evolving to some kind of runaway technology. So we have issues particular to our nation, Russia and the US, but also common vulnerability, common interests. And that's something I hope we can explore. But again, welcome to the dialogue, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much for this warm welcome. And I look very much forward to exchanging with you on issues that you have highlighted so eloquently and rightly, in my view. I also recognize Igor Polishchuk and Sarah Swidler as people standing behind this project. And I also expressed my gratitude to the organizers of this round year conference of Dialogue Fort Ross. We have now a situation when this dialogue started in 2012. And since that, the dialogue established itself as an important platform for engagement between NGOs, academia, people who are just concerned about how many things are going wrong. And I particularly appreciate that officials from the Russian side, but also from the US side, were able over time to engage in a very, I would say, thoughtful way into it. Let me once again thank you for your personal attention and personal overview of both Fort Ross Park and the whole issue of Russian presence, Russians being early visitors, friendly visitors to what is now known as the state of California, one of the most beautiful places in the US, but also in the world. I'm sure that your creative people living in California would be able to preserve and enhance the beauty of the state and defend it from all challenges that you mentioned in your opening remarks, sir. Let me also recognize the ongoing efforts of such enterprises like Transneft in Russia and Sovcomflot in Russia, but equally so by the well-known, world-renowned company Chevron of the US that very systematically and focusedly support our efforts. I wonder whether interpretation is there, because I want to say something in Russian as well. Yes,
well, let me figure out, Mr. Igor, is there an interpretation capacity here?
All right, then I continue in English, Igor, for not to, That's okay, that's fine, no problem. I just wanted to make sure that some people who do not speak English, they also follow what is happening here and how it transpires. Let me tell you in all frankness, friends and colleagues, that according to our judgment, what we see now in our bilateral relations between Russia and the US can be described as a very tough and challenging crisis, probably to an extent that it exceeds in some ways the worst situation that both of our nations experienced under the Cold War. And it may be even more dangerous because of the fact that at that time there were clear frameworks and clear rules. Now there is a great deal of uncertainty surrounding all this, and this is quite risky. I would recall what Governor Brown mentioned some time ago in terms of so-called Russian roulette situation, which the whole civilization faces, the risks of total and complete collapse of civilization being counted by some experts as high as to 1 in 6, which is a very high probability. We should remember how these numbers are alarmingly high, and we also recall on the Russian side, at the Russian government, how different associations of concerned scientists put the so-called nuclear clock 3 minutes to midnight. Before this current time of today, it was 5 minutes to midnight. Now we have only 3 minutes. Before this, clock of collapse and devastation may start ringing. It's therefore that we on the Russian side do our utmost to assuage risks associated with unintended use of nuclear weapons, and much more so to diminish probability of deliberate use of nuclear weapons. We have extended the existing START treaty for 5 more years early into this current administration in the US. We have been able equally to reconfirm a well-known formula from the time of President Reagan and Secretary General Gorbachev on inadmissibility of a nuclear war. It's a very simple formula, very straightforward one, that the nuclear war can never be won and thus should never be fought. But somehow it was quite difficult to make sure that we arrive at a point when we just say once again such things. Now we want others among P5 to be with us and reconfirm this formula as well. Let me spend a few moments on our bilateral relations with the US, purely bilateral issues. We continue efforts with counterparts at the State Department and also at other governmental agencies in the US to make sure that we at least normalize the function of our respective diplomatic presences in Russia in the US and US in Russia. We regret that because of some unexplainable reasons, the US administrations, starting from the time of Obama administration and moving through the Trump administration and also now under Biden, deprive us from both our diplomatic property and also forced to close two consular generals, one in San Francisco, another in Seattle, who served very immediate needs of many Russian citizens resident in the US, many people who have dual citizenship, and also just Russian-speaking people who benefited from those presences. Likewise, in Russia, the US diplomatic and consular presence is now diminished to a level where it's simply not possible to offer some very basic services of consular character, like issuing visas to Russian citizens which need to travel to the US. And it is required by the US side for our citizens to travel abroad, literally outside of Russia, to apply for American visas. It's a completely intolerable situation, and we invite and urge the US side to augment the US embassy in Moscow and send more officers to at least ensure that consular service here in Russia is somewhat normalized. Dialogue Fort Ross, as something that over time showed its value and its validity, invites all of us to think creatively. It's a platform where both officials and non-governmental structures, activists and businesses are coming together to brainstorm and to make sure that we not just maintain and sustain a reasonable degree of confidence, of trust between our nations, but we move further forward and we find solutions for numerous issues that were highlighted in the opening remarks by Governor Brown. I share concerns that you expressed, sir, in your opening remarks, including on the issue of artificial intelligence. Let me tell you that this issue turns now to become an integral element of our formal, sustained bilateral agenda with the US, but also more broadly with other nations who have a stake in this, who are advancing in development these technologies. We are looking into it from different perspectives, including from the perspective how important it would be at all times to ensure that artificial intelligence doesn't replace human judgment and human solutions and human decisions, especially when we are talking on the use of force, things like application of military power. And we're also looking into it from the perspective of ethical approach, where the boundaries on artificial intelligence beyond which we may have problems in terms of how intrusive it may act with respect to integrity of human beings. We are looking into it, and there is no other way but to enhance and strengthen this type of interaction. We can discuss and debate these things, but let me conclude my initial remarks by thanking once again everyone present at this video format and express my hope and desire that next year we will come back to normalcy, both in terms of re-engaging in face-to-face meetings. I was part of these debates and exchanges years ago. And I wish I would be able, in whatever capacity, in my current capacity or otherwise, to be with you again when this continues and when we have pandemic fully and completely under control. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Minister. I'm glad that you're raising this artificial intelligence. It's really such a complex topic, but very, very alive, very, very much part of what's going on in the world among the scientists and the technologists. And it has ethical issues, and it has military, and it's going to take real collaboration. One thing that just responding to what is going on now in Glasgow, Scotland, neither Russia nor China is present through their presidents. And while the US is present, nevertheless, the commitments are not adequate by the US, nor, I would have to say, by the other nations. And I say this not to be critical in this particular dialogue, but to raise the point that climate is extremely dangerous in the way it's changing. That's true right here in California. People of the world are very concerned about it, but the national leaders in Russia and China and the United States face such difficult barriers because our civilizations, our economies are based on oil, gas, and coal. And to transform these economies so that we can live on renewable energy takes time and heroic effort. And it really does require a cooperative spirit on the part of the US and Russia and the US and China and others. And I don't think we're seeing that cooperative spirit at the level needed. So there's a lot of momentum from old stories, old conflicts, old national perspectives, and those and that the weight of that past very much stands as a barrier for a constructive dialogue on the issue, I said, of climate, but also of nuclear, of the virus. So many billions of people have no access to the vaccination. And I don't see the United States pushing to make sure these companies make the vaccines available, change the rules on intellectual property, whatever has to be done. So here's an opportunity, the virus that should bring Russia and the US together and China, except we're seeing that it's a cause of discord rather than cooperation. So I think in this Fort Ross Forum, it's well to see there are common problems. And I don't think it's helpful to say, okay, it's Russia did this and the US did that. And okay, there's a lot of history going on here. The point is that we do face danger, more difficult than during the Cold War. That may be the case. That's not good. And how do we wake ourselves up? How do we rise to a more collaborative level? That's really the point of this dialogue. And in that respect, I want to make reference to the nuclear clock, the doomsday clock. I have the privilege of being the executive chairman of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. The Bulletin group puts out the clock, sets the hands of the clock each year. There's a scientific advisory committee. I actually sit on that committee, though I'm not a scientist, and the scientists deliberate very seriously each year, and they'll do so again in the next month about how dangerous is the world in terms of nuclear and other disruptive technologies, including climate. All right, the clock is now set, not at 3 minutes, but at 100 seconds we've moved it forward. Last year, we kept it at 100 seconds. The year before, it was 2 minutes to midnight. And that represented the judgment of our Science and Security Board that the world was in a very dangerous place. These people who debate this for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists are not politicians. They're scientists trying to understand how great is the danger. So I want to ask you, Mr. Deputy Minister, do you, knowing that the clock is set at 100 seconds, and we're going to take that question up again, do you feel that we can move the hands back, forward, or leave them the same? So my question really goes, how dangerous is the situation that Russia and the United States now face?
Thank you so much, Governor Brown. I'll try my best to be specific on those issues. But let me first say that we in Russia undertook a huge effort to both ensure that our commitments under both the Paris Convention and also what is being undertaken now in different formats, including in Glasgow, which you referred to, they are not just statements, but this is something that is solidly built and founded on calculations, on exact policies that are intertwined. We cannot just say now it's everything that it is about climate, and there is no such things like transfer to new technologies, huge investment demands, questions on how people can lose jobs or how can be offered new jobs, and all things in association with this. We do not underestimate problems and challenges that we face here, but clearly we play in concert. And with this administration in Washington that I would say rapidly elevated the whole issue of climate and climate change among its priorities, we have established a functioning dialogue at the level of US Special Envoy, former Secretary of State Kerry, and the respective people on our part. And our delegation in Glasgow is led by a very senior positioned official, which is Vice Prime Minister. We have all agencies on board, and we will subscribe to what is responsible and what helps to ensure that these climate change devastating processes are being contained through interaction with different, both with governments, but also with private sector and beyond. This is where we are, and I'm hopeful that Glasgow will send reassuring signals to everyone, and this real action and real work will enhance and will be reinforced after that important meeting. On the second part of our exchange right now, let me tell you that we are alarmed but by what we see as an ongoing process of dismantlement, removal, destruction of several important elements of what we believed was a functioning arms control architecture. We do not have ABM treaty anymore. We do not have INF treaty. We do not have US and Russian participation in the so-called Open Skies Treaty and other examples. Meanwhile, we have very limited progress in the area of establishing forms of arms control with respect to new technologies, in regard to factors that are obviously are out there in terms of how quote unquote new arrivals in the area of armaments and tactics, that is how to apply those armaments, those new arrivals look like destabilizing ones. We do not have answers to several questions, and all these is now being an integral element of restarted Russian-US strategic stability dialogue. I am gratified that after the first face-to-face meeting between President Putin and President Biden in June in Geneva, we were able to re-engage on an interagency basis with the US, and we have subsequently went through two interagency sessions and established working groups and engage very intensively in this effort, with the involvement of the military, with the involvement of people who stand for nuclear, be it Department of Energy on the US side or Rosatom on the Russian side, and things like this. Well, you may tell me you sound way too bureaucratic in your proposition. You ask political questions, but you're a politician. You were elected by people. I am just serving my government. I follow my instructions. But my point here is we are deadly serious about this, deadly in good sense of the word, but also being very well aware of tragic, dramatic consequences of something. If something goes wrong, if we fail, then it may be way too late to kind of revisit or do something alternatively. We understand this. We will work accordingly, being very conscious of what we are doing. Hopefully our colleagues on the US side are of the very same view. Thank you.
On that point, how do you see discussions on missile defense fitting in to the Russian-US arms control dialogue?
On missile defense, sir, we operate under assumption, let me say it this way, that the Biden administration would be able, in the time to come, to meaningfully address concerns that we associate with this issue. We think it was fundamentally a wrong decision when under the Clinton II administration, but much more so under George W. Bush administration, the US decided to opt for a gradual development of what now looks more and more like a global multi-layered missile defense. I don't think the US would ever be able to establish through this very capital intensive and very expensive in all other senses of the word, a waterproof, 100% watertight shield over itself. I don't think so. At best, the US would be able to protect itself from limited missile attacks from some very specific directions. But as technologies move on and as additional capabilities being built and added to the US toolbox in this area, we see more and more of a risky situations when these capabilities may eventually begin to undermine, if not to devaluate altogether, critical elements of the Russian strategic deterrence. We do not want this to happen. We consistently believe in separable interlink between strategic offensive and strategic defensive capabilities of either side, as set forth in the preamble of the existing START. So when we are talking on what's next and what may eventually replace the existing START, we say, let's try to give answers to the so-called new security equation, where this aspect would be also addressed one way or another. And we are hopeful that the Biden administration would be more receptive than its predecessor, the Trump administration, on the issue that we should not lose any more time, and we should focusedly work on a framework with the right scope and parameters where we ensure that missile defense of the US serves the right purpose and doesn't rock the fundamentals of the strategic stability. Okay?
And do you think that has to be a part of the current ongoing strategic dialogue between Russia and the US?
Yes, very much so, sir. And we will look for that this happens in anticipation that counterparts on the US side would be, I would say, responsible enough and receptive enough to engage in discussion what's going on and how to address this. They have their own views on what we are doing here and there. We do not foreclose any aspect of this debate. We, in fact, established quite an extensive, and I would even say comprehensive agenda for our effort, including through the two working groups. One is being called a working group on principles and objectives of the future arms control, another one on capabilities and actions with a potential strategic effect. So one is about, so to say, ideology of arms control, another one about what kind of weapons we do have, what kind of arms we have, and how we eventually use or not use them. I think it's a very right proposition. I'm hopeful we will use those platforms to progress. And in 1 year, when we have next Fort Ross dialogue, preferably in face-to-face format, my hope would be that we report to the audience and to yourself on how we progress since this exchange of today.
Do you think we're making progress as we speak today?
No, because we do not have any meetings in this format, although some other important issues are ongoing exactly the very same hour as we speak, but not on arms control. It will be continued within weeks from now, and we will intensify the pace of our dialogue.
So can I interpret that as that you're hopeful, that you're concerned, that you're worried? How do I describe your state of mind relative to arms control negotiations between the US and Russia?
I am concerned by the fact that we were not able to sustain many important elements of the proven architecture, of the proven kind of structure that served the purpose of strengthening strategic stability. We have lost some important elements. What I am somewhat reassured by now is that we put behind us a moment when there was further, I would say, slide down to be seen before us. We are now gradually stabilizing this. We are moving at a plateau from where I hope we may start slowly climbing upwards to a better situation.
Good. Well, we always face the difficulty because the Russian system of government, as I understand it, and the American system of government are quite different. And both present problems, I think, for each to understand because they're so different, particularly the role of Congress and the role of so much change. But let me ask you, you use the term strategic stability. Do you have is it clear what we're talking about at this point? When you use the term strategic stability, is it America, Russia, are we all on the same page here, or are there some different conceptions that we ought to elucidate.
First, let me say a word on what you mentioned earlier. Indeed, we are different, and the system of governance and how governments function are different. But it doesn't mean that we cannot communicate or deal with things proactively. And it's not just, you know, about something that is obvious and contractual in a sense. We may well be more forward-looking and thinking broadly and be of a very open mind. And we know each other. After all, there is a good school of American studies in Russia in different places, and many people in the US also, although fewer than before, unfortunately, are interested in Russia, in Russians, and the more important, in my view, thus are things like the current Fort Ross dialogue on strategic stability. Well, you know, the classic interpretation of strategic stability is a state of a military posture that ensures that potential adversary, that is the other side, is deterred from using its capability for a military attack, much less with the use of nuclear weapons. Now, with the arrival of new technologies, we have this term seemingly somewhat, I would say, of somewhat broader interpretation. It's hard to agree exactly. At least it's not been possible for us and the US counterparts to agree on an expanded formula for strategic stability. But I am hopeful that it will come, and it will make one of the important building blocks, important ingredients of the future, more predictable, less risky relationship in the area, you know, of military interaction, if you wish. We have an excellent experience through so-called deconflicting in Syria, where our respective forces are in close proximity. Nonetheless, for several years now, there were no substantial incidents with, you know, with no grave consequences. We have avoided this because we have established a practice, a routine, a pattern of deconflicting interaction between our military. We should expand this into other areas. We should equally modernize the so-called bilateral agreement on avoidance of dangerous incidents in high seas and at airspace above it, where both our respective navies and our air forces more frequently find themselves in situations where potential escalation should be managed. We have provided the US side with our ideas how to do it in very specific terms, in terms of distances, improvement of communication, things like this. I'm hopeful that the US side would be able to come back and we would finalize these efforts sooner rather than later. Let me ask you one question, Governor Brown. In my opening remarks, I mentioned that unfortunately we were not able to keep our consulate presences in San Francisco, California, and Seattle, Washington State. It's way too bad. It's unfortunate. Do you think it's the very fact that we are no more in those places in form of our consular presences, do you think this is a new normalcy, or should we work towards reestablishment of this in parallel with the US reopening consulates in the Urals, in the Russian Far East, and in St. Petersburg, where we have no US consulate general anymore? Thank you.
No, I don't think it has to be a new normal. And I say that because there's so much change, and shifting of perspectives, that what is thought today about keeping these consulates closed does not prevent us tomorrow or in the succeeding month or year to re-examine it and to open it. I believe the Russian consulate in America in San Francisco was opened back in the 1850s, if I'm not mistaken. It opened for a very long time. So if there was a problem, it would seem that there would have been attempts to close it many times before, but it was only just recently that it was closed. Now, I did raise the question with one of our senators, and Dianne Feinstein, and she made some inquiries, and she got the response back, well, there's a lot of spying going on, and so that's why we closed it. I don't know whether that was a reliable report. I don't know what that all means, because all the countries have intelligence operations that they undergo. So I don't know quite what that was. And I know there doesn't seem to be much movement. But from my point of view, I think dialogue is imperative. There's not enough. And certainly the consulate had very positive elements from my point of view. And just personally, I want to bring up the point that right here at my ranch in Northern California, I grow olives, and the person that has the equipment to press the olives into olive oil is a Russian who became an American, and she wanted to bring her mother over, and the mother was denied a visa, and so I actually called the American ambassador and said, why can't she get a visa? And he told me she just can't get one. She has to go to a third country, but she was not a woman who had any money. She couldn't go to a third country. So I think that's an example of harm that should definitely be changed. And I don't know quite how we can get our consulates open. I don't know what Russia isn't doing or should do, or how it's perceived in Washington. But I definitely think, given the stakes, the dangers, and the opportunities, that consular service should be expanded. And so that's my point of view. And I'm going to do some things that I think I could help push this along.
I thank you, Governor, for your remarks and for your extensive explanation. I agree to much of what you've just said. A side remark on intelligence activities. Number one, it's, as you said, everyone does so. I think services that should act as counterintelligence are there, and they are paid for just to make sure that they follow all sorts of wrongdoings. And it's very valid in Russia for the US activities, as it is, I believe, in the US. But it doesn't mean that just because of such things happening, we should close everything and then let people who have no clue, no idea on whatever intelligence might take place somewhere to suffer in their personal situations where they simply need to travel, as you have explained, and they are not able to do so. And they need to spend fortunes to travel to third countries, so to say, to apply for visas and stay in rows there somewhere, thousands of miles from their home place. But another thing I would tell you, we need diplomatic presences as the tools for dialogue, as facilitators of resolving issues. We do not need this to turn into a problem itself between our two countries, which it is now. This is very wrong, very contrary to the very notion of diplomacy. Let me give you another example. Some days ago, 8 officers, that served that Russian NATO mission were expelled upon a decision by the NATO Secretariat, I believe. And they gave explanation that those officers were involved in intelligence activities. And they were not, because we know whom they are. To an extent that the general manager of the Russian NATO mission was among those person who just, ensures that offices are clean and tidy, But what happened then? We just closed this mission altogether and asked our bilateral ambassador in Brussels to serve as a communication point, a point of contact if NATO needs to send some signal to Russia. Is it something that serves anyone's interest? I mean, those intelligence cards, quote unquote, are overplayed by our Western partners, both in the US and in Brussels. We should stop somewhere. We should rebuild everything. Otherwise, it will end that all diplomatic presences would be closed. And, this downward spiral in terms of numbers of personnel serving in either country may well end that embassy would be even closed in Washington and in Moscow if we do not stop. We want this to stop. We do not want further cases where people are being expelled and this retaliatory negative spiral continues. We strongly urge the US administration to do so publicly and privately, to reconsider and engage with us in a meaningful dialogue where we nullify mutual requirements and start from scratch to build up and not moving further down.
By the way, I don't know these matters particularly, but I did have a dinner at the San Francisco Russian consulate. And as part of the dinner, the cook came out of the kitchen to display a Russian-style fish that he was cooking. And he later, subsequently, was on the list to be expelled as a spy. So I don't know whether your intelligence people learn cooking as part of their trade, but I can tell you it was a very tasty fish.
Well, I don't know. Thank you for this story. I don't know anything particular on this guy. What I know for sure that they were required to leave San Francisco within 24 hours. Incredible. I mean, the whole staff of the Russian consulate was asked to leave within 24 hours. Imagine what it meant, how they could, bring their belongings together. Well, I hate these diplomatic wars. I have a lot of sympathy with the US officers that were asked to have only 24 hours to leave St. Petersburg. We couldn't answer otherwise. Sorry about this, but it was not our choice. We should stop it somewhere at some point.
Yeah, I certainly hope that is coming. Let me ask you, in this dialogue between Russia and the US, is it complicated by the emergence of China and perhaps other powers? How does this strategic dialogue get at the issues in a complete way when there are other nuclear powers in the world as well that have an impact on both countries?
Thanks a lot. Let me say the following. Several years ago, even before Donald Trump was elected to the highest executive position in the US, that is the President of the United States, the Russian Federation introduced as its official position an idea that the more we move further forward in the area of arms control and nuclear disarmament, the more important it would be to, quote unquote, multilateralize, that is, to bring others in possession of similar capabilities into the process, to factor what they have in our further efforts. Now, we have a very special relationship between Russia and China. It's a very advanced one. We have a lot of confidence with each other. We do not have particularly any pressing problems of a bilateral nature between ourselves. And I will make no secret out of the fact that we cherish this. We do not want this to be jeopardized. We have a border that is more than 5,000 kilometers long, and we do not need any troubles at this border and elsewhere. So what we have now is a situation when China strongly believes that US and Russia, being still the most powerful nuclear powers, they would need to continue their bilateral efforts in the area of nuclear arms control and disarmament before China would eventually consider otherwise. We respect this position. We do not want this to be challenged. We do think equally that capabilities of the US closest allies in Europe, that is of UK and France, who possess considerable numbers in the area of their own national strategic deterrence, those capabilities should be also taken into consideration when we find our way forward to a new strategic stability formula or strategic equation, to use the standard language of the Russian position. Well, UK and France are sovereign nations, and they say, look, we are not ready to go there. Again, like with China, we respect this. And so what's the answer? My answer would be, let's pursue the second best option in all this, which is to continue our efforts bilaterally with the US and to make sure that at some point in a not so distant future, we arrive at a proper mix of a possible legally binding agreement, executive agreement or agreements, and possible even politically binding statements to cover the whole ground, to cover the whole space, which is very different from what we had at the time when the classic arms control started during Brezhnev-Nixon era, say 50 years ago or something. This is probably what I have to share with you, responding to your very deep and wise question. We are very focused on all this, Governor, very focused.
So you think the US and Russia can make progress, just the two countries together, developing more stable agreements?
Yes, I believe so. I believe so. And more, we will work towards this end bilaterally with our American counterparts.
Let me ask you this. If things went wrong and a nuclear war started or a nuclear use, how do you think that terrible outcome could be precipitated? In other words, what do you fear might happen by way of a miscalculation or something? Have you ever thought, in other words, to prevent something, it's good to be able to think of what it might be. So I'm just curious, have you thought about what might go wrong, or what's the most likely way the US and Russia could get into trouble on the nuclear front?
First of all, our central focal and the essential point of gravity, the overall preoccupation of ours on the Russian side is to make sure that this never happens. We should diminish risks of unintended unintended incident, which is inconceivable in itself in terms of its consequences. There are protocols of communication. There are ways how to deal with this, like was done at the so-called presidential initiative, through so-called presidential initiatives in early 90s, where, for instance, Russian non-strategic nuclear weapons was stored centrally, that is, apart from delivery means. They are not deployed on delivery means, and they are stockpiled in very different places. Things like this, they are stabilizing. In terms of doctrines, I would say we are concerned by the fact that in recent years, the US side deliberately introduced additional ambiguity into the issue, what might be the circumstances under which possible use of nuclear weapons would be conceivable. We need more certainty here. And on the Russian side, we have now 3 basic documents of a very recent dato that, being looked combined, give you an explanation in what extremely hypothetical circumstances the possible use of nuclear weapons could be conceived. I think we are working towards elevating nuclear threshold. We will do it both through further development of doctrinal thinking in our exchanges with the US. Hopefully, it would be reflected upon in the nuclear posture review that is ongoing in the US. We are hopeful that our discussions may positively impact the US thinking. And we also believe that through further efforts in the area of nuclear arms control and strategic stability altogether, we may have a reassuring reality where risks for such an unimaginable development would be lower than many people believe they are right now.
Do you have any thoughts on there was an article in the Financial Times, this would be my last question, in the Financial Times about certain NATO countries expressing worry that the nuclear posture of America might be changed, and that some doctrine of no first use or sole use could be developed. Do you have any thoughts on those expressions by European nations?
Governor, you know, whatever I say may be misinterpreted, especially when we are talking on such extraordinary sensitive issue like relationship between US and its allies. I better leave this for the alliance to figure out. My broader proposition is, though, we will favor everything that would diminish uncertainty in this area, give more clarity, and also ensure that the nuclear threshold would be set higher than it is today. And it's very reciprocal, like everything in our relationship. We would be prepared to entertain these discussions, these exchanges with the US on an interagency basis as we move on in our strategic stability dialogue with the Biden administration.
Well, thank you. That's, I certainly hope that occurs. I'll just end by saying that the relation with Russia and the US is profoundly important, but I also think it's profoundly important that people understand that we are not only in a world threatened by nuclear, but threatened by the changes in the climate and the advances in artificial intelligence, as well as the advances in engineering, genetic engineering, the lowering of the cost of things like Casper 4, and that could allow certain groups to engineer dangerous viruses. So I think we're in a world of common threat, common vulnerability that should bind Russia and the US and other nations under what I would call my doctrine of planetary realism, getting real about the way the world is now with its potential for destruction. So I just raised that point, and I want to express my appreciation for you taking the time to talk to me, not even being in power. So I appreciate that, and I certainly will endeavor to do whatever I can to foster the kind of relationship that will allow the U.S. and Russia to thrive and not to further deepen the anxieties and the dangers.
Governor, thanks a lot. I appreciate your kind words. It's really an honor for me to talk to you today, this morning. I conclude we have a great commonality of views on many things, which is heartening. I wish you all best in all your endeavors. I appreciate Fort Ross once again for this opportunity. I wish everyone to stay healthy and sound in this circumstance, and we will be back in an old normal format, I'm sure, sooner rather than later. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Same, and I look forward to greeting you at Fort Ross whenever that becomes possible. Thank you. Thank you very much.